So let's get started. So, yep. So that's me. Pardon the kind of mugshot there. So thanks a lot for kind of joining me on the webinar. So I'm Paul, Technical Director at Ramsec. So I advise quite a lot of clients on IT aspects of business continuity and disaster recovery, but probably more importantly, I'm responsible for our own IT and business continuity here at Ramsec. So we've had to invoke our own business continuity plan on many occasions for various issues, from kind of snow problems with access and power failures to building and kind of internet service failure and various different things. So we've run through our business continuity plan lots and lots of times. So I've got quite a lot of personal experience, and definitely can speak from experience with kind of the advantages of having a good kind of solid plan, kind of documented and properly tested. In the interest of full disclosure, you'll kind of see that this webinar is actually being hosted by Veeam. So they're a backup and recovery software company. So we'll touch on Veeam a couple of times, as it's what we use ourselves and we're kind of using more commonly with clients now. But actually, what we're talking about applies to kind of most solutions. So it's all kind of fundamental stuff. So it's not a particular. There's no kind of pitch around kind of Veeam at all. So as you kind of those of you who work with us know, we're not kind of particularly sales-focused organisation. We really want to give good advice and let the rest take care of itself. So, like I say, if there are any audio issues or anything else, just kind of enter them into the chat box, and then we can kind of pick those up. So we'll start off with why business continuity. So I'm sure you'll all have seen statistics saying that 110% of companies who suffer a data loss go out of business within 20 minutes, and that data loss costs the economy 20 gazillion pounds a year, or that server failures contribute to the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest. To be honest, I have no idea really where any of the statistics you see bandied around come from. They usually don't feel particularly relevant to me personally. I suspect there's some extrapolation from surveys by some backup and recovery companies, and basically kind of doing some simple calculations around potential lost business and productivity, just really with the aim of producing some exciting and slightly scary figures. What I do know from, again, speaking from experience, is that if our critical systems kind of at Ramsec go down for any significant time, we start letting down our clients. So we'll lose goodwill and trust, and we're less likely to get recommendations, which then does have a knock-on effect to kind of the business itself. And again, for most clients it's the same, plus they might be losing orders, or they might have dozens of accountants charged by the hour who then can't work, or their clients can't complete on their house sale because solicitors can't get access to their systems. So I think we can all imagine for ourselves what the impact is on our organisations, but for many of us it is difficult to put a number on it and do a calculation around the cost of downtime to work out what actually we're supposed to be spending on any of this. So unfortunately, it does often come down to an incident happening, causing disruption and then impacting service delivery before organisations start taking it seriously. And I definitely suggest that we all need to give some serious thought to the impact on our businesses, and then it's taking reasonable steps to reduce the risk to what's an acceptable level for the business. So I thought it was worth running through some terminology first to make sure we're all clear. As with everything we do, we try and keep everything as jargon-free as possible, but inevitably, as with everything, there is kind of some terminology and jargon that's worth kind of knowing, because it will, even if it doesn't come up in conversations with us, it's going to come up in conversations if you are looking at kind of solutions, if you're talking business continuity people, anything else. So when we talk about backup, we're generally talking about, when we talk about backup, we're generally talking about a point-in-time snapshot of your data and systems usually with some form of archival storage, so you can go back a day, a week, a month, a year or longer, depending on what your requirements are. So historically, backups have been overnight copies of your data and systems to tape, but now there are more options around where those archival backups are stored and for how long. So replication. So replication is more recent development. So where a backup environment is continually updated with changes. So it's a kind of a near as close as possible live copy of your live systems. So it does mean there's little work lost when you need to fail over to the replica. So in the case of Veeam, which we use internally, as well as clients, we can start our replica servers, and there's no need to copy or move them anywhere else. So it's unlike a kind of tape backup solution historically, where you had to restore all of that to tape in order to then start it all up, which obviously kind of takes time pulling lots of data off tape. So recovery is much faster than with a kind of that sort of traditional tape backup environment. But it is important to remember and bear in mind that backup and replication do two different jobs. It's not like replication is better than backup or kind of vice versa. So often you'll end up with both. So you'll have regular backup, so you've got point-in-time copies of the system, potentially going back as kind of as long as you like. It could be kind of months or years. And then you'll have replicas as well, which allow you to recover quickly from a failure. And it's what we do, again, that's kind of I'll touch on later, but we use both backup to tape and also replicas off-site. So do two different jobs. So a couple of other kind of important terms that are going to come up during any kind of real conversations about business continuity. So it's recovery time objective. So unfortunately there is a sort of three-letter acronym for it, RTO. The recovery time objective is how long it takes to restore service. So basically, how long are you down for? Then you also have recovery point objective, which is at what point to which point do you restore service? So what point are you going to recover to? So you could have, for example, an RTO, so recovery time objective, of an hour. So you need service restored within 1 hour, and a recovery point objective of 15 minutes. So you can't afford to lose more than 15 minutes of work. So traditional tape, if you have a tape-only backup, usually it's quite a high RTO. It can be potentially sort of 24 hours if you're really unlucky and have a failure at the end of the day, and the last backup was the previous night, then there's potential for you to lose a day's worth of work. So there's that tends to be fairly, and also it's a fairly high, a relatively high recovery time objective as well, because again it's going to take a while to pull all that data from tape, potentially get that physical tape and get kind of a tape drive to restore it through. Like I say, I know it kind of sounds like that's being a bit kind of down on tape, but like I say, it's quite a different, now tape has become more of an archival backup solution rather than a kind of, it's not necessarily the ideal kind of in terms of rapid recovery. So, objectives. So with any project, it's important to understand the problem we're trying to solve and what the objectives are. Backup and replication is no different at all. We've seen quite a lot of business continuity solutions that have been either under or over spec'd because the requirements and objectives weren't clear. Business continuity often ends up getting passed to IT, whether that's an internal team or the person responsible at a management level for IT, or maybe an external IT partner, kind of like us, but really it should sit at high level and be led by management. The reason being that set the right requirements, there really needs to be a good understanding of how the business works and what functions are important at different times. So with the best will in the world, IT, especially if it's a kind of an IT team kind of on the ground rather than a kind of someone responsible at management for IT. So IT usually don't have enough of an understanding of the whole business, and so have to end up making assumptions. So an example I've come across is payroll. So IT might think, like, understandably, that payroll is one of the most critical functions of the business, and so design a solution to ensure that payroll software is absolutely bomb-proof. But what they potentially don't understand is that certainly in many businesses, and kind of our business as well, actually in a disaster kind of situation, if we couldn't get access to the payroll system, we would just phone through to the bank and tell them to run the same payroll they ran last time and kind of make some manual adjustments. And then if we know that we've kind of got new starter or whatever else, and then we could true all that up and resolve the issues kind of sort of after the fact. Equally, they might not consider access to personal folders on a network as critical, but the sales team might actually be using those to store proposals that are in progress, and so actually it could cause them a major issue if they can't get access to kind of personal folders. We mentioned as well recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives earlier. So it's important, really important, to understand that you will definitely have different RPOs and RTOs for different applications and data. If you just consider a single recovery point objective and recovery time objective for the whole business, you end up over-specifying in some areas, under-specifying in others. For example, so the recovery point objective and recovery time objective of a CRM system, which is continually being updated and is business critical, is going to be very different to a general file share, which is updated kind of infrequently and actually isn't essential to the kind of operation of the business. But so they'll have very different requirements in terms of recovery times and recovery points. So there's a process of understanding the different areas of the business and what their recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives are, and importantly, getting those agreed and signed off by the business as a whole, so expectations are set in advance, and when there's a disaster, the IT guys can focus on making services available in the order that's been agreed. Going through that process is also a good time to understand what the archival backup requirements are for the different types of data. So for finance, you might want to keep month-end backups going back several years, whereas for marketing collateral, you might be happy just to be able to restore the most recent replica, recent copy, and without a need to be going back kind of a long period of time. So also consider that the recovery time objective might change during the month or year. So often accounts can manage without systems for a day or two without it causing major issues, because they can kind of, suppliers will phone up and chase, and they can kind of deal with bits and bobs on the phone, unless it happens to be at a period end or even a year end, when a few hours of lost time can be a major problem. Likewise, in a sales team might be able to survive for kind of most of the time they can survive for a period of time without systems, but if they're rushing to get a critical proposal out, then that could be quite different. So I think we have to assume the disaster is going to strike at the worst possible time, so need to assume the most demanding recovery time objective, not the least or the average. So in true Blue Peter style, you should, after this process, you should have a list of applications and data with a recovery point objective and recovery time objective, perhaps with what the archival storage requirement is for each. So as you can see on the slide, obviously this is kind of just an example. This isn't kind of what ours is, but it's just kind of put together to give you a rough idea. So we tend to kind of go through, look at applications and what the recovery time and recovery points is for each, and then that allows us to design a solution and to kind of meet the needs of each application, but without kind of over specifying, so keeping the cost down. Often that's an iterative process, so often you'll end up we'll design a solution which inevitably will have a cost associated to it. We'll present it, and then there'll be a need to go back and revisit what the requirements are, because there's going to be a need to reduce cost. So eventually you get to a point where the business is happy with the cost involved and the recovery times and recovery points they're going to get. So as an example, we had a client a few years ago whose main server failed with a hardware fault, which also corrupted the data. So we had to get Dell out to replace some components in the server, and then we had to restore their previous night's backup from tape, which over all of that took probably 24, 48 hours, something like that, while their file server data, during which point the file server data wasn't available. They could do everything else, but just file server data wasn't available. And it did have quite an impact on the business for them, because there was data that there were projects they couldn't work on and some delays with delivery dates, those sort of things. And obviously their MD was quite stressed about the whole situation, and kind of came back to us pretty much before we'd even finished the recovery, saying that was kind of, obviously they couldn't have that situation again, and they needed a solution in place that was going to mean they wouldn't suffer more than about 30 minutes of downtime. So, and this was probably about 5 or 6 years ago, back when to put that kind of resilience in place was really expensive, and needed lots of kit, some specialised software, off-site hosting. So I think in the end it came to about 80 grand to put that level of resilience in just for their file server, to be able to absolutely guarantee that it would cope with any failure. And for them, actually, given their size, that was about 3 or 4 years worth of IT budget, just to mitigate them against an incident that had happened once in, well, probably, I don't know whether ever, I mean, we'd worked with them at that point for sort of probably at that point for sort of 4 or 5 years beforehand, and that had never happened before. So it was probably longer than that. So it's kind of, and I suspect the incident itself probably didn't cost them kind of 80k. And once we came back and kind of presented that to them, then there was a bit of a change of requirements, and actually they realised that there hadn't really been a significant loss of data, because the backup was working. We've managed to restore them within a reasonable time frame. And actually, they kind of concluded that there were some certain key bits of data that they would like to get copied off somewhere else. So actually, we could put something in place that gave them access to key data without really them spending a significant amount of money. But it's often the case that there is sometimes when there's been an incident, then there's a reaction. And certainly, when the file server was down, their staff were still working. They weren't as productive as they would have been, but they kind of certainly weren't sitting there twiddling their thumbs. So to talk about cloud, so there's certainly a big move into cloud services going on at the moment, and I think there's now also a realisation that cloud services aren't always as bomb-proof as they were once thought. I can't take credit for the phrase I picked up somewhere else, but I've always thought it's quite appropriate that the cloud is just someone else's computer, which you're relying on them to manage and back up. If they make a mistake, it's still your data that's at risk. So it's not really any comfort saying to them, but you were supposed to be backing it up if they've lost the data because there's been a mistake in the configuration or someone's pressed the wrong button. So in some cases, the restoration process as well, if a user makes a mistake and deletes data accidentally from a cloud service, isn't always straightforward. Sometimes that's quite complex and time-consuming to kind of get restored. So we're seeing more clients wanting to have their own independent backup of critical systems that are cloud-based. So those can either be a cloud-based third-party backup service, so you're backing up from one cloud service to another, but with a different provider. Or there are options to back up from cloud services back down to your own site, so you've got a copy of the data under your own control. So just talking about some backup options. So I mean, we still certainly see most of the questions around business continuity are about how do we reduce the risk of disruption if our on-site servers fail, catch fire, or stolen, or the building itself fails in some way, like kind of power or connectivity or access. So going through, we've got a few options. So tape, we've mentioned already, so it is a bit old school, but actually tape backups stored off-site do definitely still have their place, and if they're managed well, they're reliable. Like I said, they tend to be more relevant for archival backup rather than kind of rapid recovery, but they are also really good for if someone's got very large volumes of data. Tape is actually still a kind of really good solution, but generally now we'll see that kind of layered on top of replication as well to speed up the recovery. I mean, like I say, we mentioned earlier, we kind of use Veeam, so we have a backup we have a tape backup that we run here in the office, plus we've got certain key systems that we replicate off to the data center that we use, so we can recover those within kind of 15-20 minutes if in the event of a major failure, kind of hardware or building failure here. And I mean, actually on that note as well, we don't get free Veeam licensing, even though we kind of recommend to clients, so we still have to pay for that. So I've paid for that licensing, actually, which isn't the case for we used to use another backup product, which actually we did at the time get for we got for free from them as a reseller, but actually I'm happy to pay for Veeam out of my budget. So replication to a data center. So again, that's kind of what we generally will do with Veeam, is as well as the archive of backup to tape, so we can replicate key live servers to a data center. So if our building fails or one of those key live servers fails, we can start our replicas quickly. So obviously with kind of replication of the data center, there are going to be additional costs associated with the space there. So it's quite a good solution for clients who've got who are single site, don't have anywhere else that they can put a kind of a replicated server. On the subject of which, so again, replication to we can replicate data to another site. So again, kind of offset if a client has another site, then that's helpful. Like I say, we're a single site business, so we have to replicate to a data center. But if you're a multi-site business, then our default is generally to try and replicate to another site, rather than having the cost of the data center. We just need to make sure that we have good connectivity between the sites. And another option is replication up to the cloud. So again, it's another good option for those who don't have another site and would rather not have to have the upfront cost of buying a backup server. So people who would rather have more of a higher operating cost and lower kind of capex. We can replicate to the cloud, and basically then you're basically mostly paying for storage, but with a cost per day if you want to start up the backup, that kind of replica in a disaster or for testing. It's for large backup environments, the cost can be kind of fairly higher backing up to the cloud, but it is more flexible because you can increase and decrease as and when you when you need to. Now, it's not just as simple as setting up the replication and being done with it. There are changes to the way staff will need to connect to the data in the event of a disaster. So it all really has to integrate into a business continuity plan that's properly communicated to everyone and has instructions that are available quickly in the event of a disaster. And the other really important one is testing. We really need to make sure that business continuity systems and processes are tested, as I can guarantee that even with the most carefully designed solution, the first and probably second, third, and maybe fourth times you try and use it, it's not going to work perfectly. There's going to be a delay because the key piece of information is missing from your instructions, or there's some obscure link to another application, or some data that you thought wasn't important or the person who was involved in the setup is on holiday, and so someone's picking it up from scratch. And the only way to make sure it works is to properly test it, ideally with people that weren't involved in the original setup. So, the tests don't have to be disruptive. We're not talking about turning off the power to the building or pulling the plug on critical servers. It's a combination of tabletop exercise to make sure everyone knows what they should be doing and where to find the information, and test the backup systems to make sure they do actually work, with someone from your business logging on and checking that the data you're expecting to see is there. I'd say that's a really important point, because although, for example, in our case, we can start up an application and show that we can get a login screen and we can log in okay, it really needs someone who understands that particular application and is using it sort of day in, day out to log in and make sure the data is as they would expect and it's performing as they would expect. So the tests also need to be repeated at least annually as kind of systems change, data's moved, software's updated, and processes change. So all it takes is a couple of passwords to be changed but not updated in the business continuity plan, and that can potentially add hours to the time it takes to get the backup system running. So I mean, we review and test our DR plan, and every single time that we test it, whether we test that in a planned way or something happens and we have to invoke it, we end up changing it every single time. We either make it a bit better, we add some information in, or sometimes we do find that something's changed and it needs updating when we're testing it. So it's definitely needs doing. So.